Great. Our next section is more than just R, and starting us off this morning is Ted Laderas with a gradual introduction to web APIs and JSON. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. This is meant to be a very kind of gentle introduction to web APIs and JSON. And if you don't know what those are, that's okay. We'll get to it. So if you want to follow along, these are the packages that we use. The slides are going to be available to you online. Everything is in a Posit Cloud project. So like you can kind of clone this to your own Posit Cloud account, and then you can play with like the different APIs. Okay, who is this talk for? And I have to admit, I'm the first one here. I'm like anyone who has heard the term API and ran away in fear. And then, maybe you know a little bit about web APIs, but you've never made an API call in R. So this is all meant to kind of demystify the process. So I am a teacher, so I have learning objectives. So by the end of this talk, you should be able to define web APIs and how to interact with them. Utilize the HTTR2 package, don't try to say that fast, to send requests and receive responses to an API. And then use the jsonlite package to extract data frames. So what are APIs? So I'm not going to say they're simple, but I'm going to try to explain it in clear language. So an API is short for Application Program Interface. Specifically, I'm going to define a web API, and that's going to be a programmatic way to interact with a web service that allows us to automate the retrieval of data. So all of those cool apps that used to use Twitter, now X, I guess now you have to pay for it, but everything that kind of used that, those were using like the Twitter API. So I just want to, you don't have to follow all of the code. I just want you to have a framework of how you actually start working with an API. So number one is trying to make sense of the API documentation. This can be a non-trivial step. I find API documentation to be very hard to read sometimes. And then you're going to find some way to interact with the API. We'll talk about API endpoints in a second. And now you're going to poke at the API. You're going to say, I need stuff. So that's where we start a request. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, if we did our request right, the API server will be like, fine, here's your stuff. And then this is one of the hardest parts is like, how do you get the stuff out of what the API just sent to you? So, and this is where I want the online Slack community to jump in. So I'm going to have an endpoint in just a second. There is an API for catfacts at catfact.ninja. You can look at the API documentation here, and we're going to talk about an endpoint for this API. So what is an endpoint? So we have the URL, which is catfact.ninja, and a URL, I think of it as like a function that lets you kind of interact with the API. So this one is called /fact. So you basically add it to the end of the URL here. So let's try it out. And so this is where I want the Slack people who are listening to paste the fact that you get. So if you go to catfact.ninja/fact, you can see here's a fact that it spits back at you. And you can see it's in a very specific format. This is what's called JSON, which we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But you can see it returns a fact. Like if your cat snores or rolls on its back to expose its belly, it means he trusts you. So this is your chance to add your fact to the Slack. So what happens when we hit that endpoint? So this is us on the left here, and this is the API server. So we send a request. So we say, hey, catfact.ninja, give me something from /fact. So catfact.ninja gives us some sort of cat fact, and it says cats are cool. So the trick with interacting with APIs is not only putting together this request but it's also getting stuff out of the response. So we just, anyone who hit the catfact Ninja endpoint, we just did that in our web browser. But you'll know one thing to keep in mind is that when you are hitting, when you're actually programmatically doing this, you have to construct what's called a request. And so we'll first take our URL here, and then we will basically use this request function to basically start putting it in the format that the web server is expecting. So we start with the request. And so what we can do, we can actually look at what we're sending with this REQ dry run function here. And so this is what we're actually sending to the server to get our response. So this, again, I don't want you to kind of worry too much about it, but there's a lot of different kind of bits and pieces of the anatomy of a HTTP request. The nice thing about it is we didn't have to write this. The Cacadia-R package helped us do that. They really need to change that name because it is really hard to say out loud. So like we just basically took our URL and it constructed that request for us. So that was just the actual request, but if we actually want it to fetch stuff, we need to pipe our request into rec_perform, and we'll get a response. And this looks very messy. So just a second. So if we actually scroll down, what we want is at the very bottom here. We don't want any of that other stuff. This is in that JSON format that I was talking about. And so like if we kind of make it a little easier, so this is the fact we want to access. So we know it's JSON. So we take our response and we pipe it into this function called response body JSON. And you'll see what returns is actually a list. And if you remember, there was a slot called fact and there was a slot called length. So what we have, we don't actually work with the JSON here. This is a nice thing about this package. We work with lists. So if we wanted the actual fact, we use the $ operator to get to basically hit it. Everyone with me so far? Okay, great. So talked a little bit about JSON. So I hate jargon, but this is one that's used everywhere, short for JavaScript object notation. And why is it using JSON useful? So these are the technical reasons, but really JSON is a language of the internet. So this is how you are going to interact and get information out. So knowing a little bit about JSON structure will help you in interacting with these APIs. Okay, so here's an example of a JSON structure. So we've got, I'm not going to go into this too much in depth. We'll translate this into a list anyhow. But you can see that much like a list in R, there are named keys. So like, we've got a slot here called horse, and that contains the value called Mustang. Whereas here with cows, this is actually a list of stuff. So that's just to give you kind of a little example of what JSON is like. But as Dror mentioned, it's one of these things that can get endlessly deep and deep and deep. So that's why it's really important to translate JSON. I mean, really all the time, the internet speaks JSON, but we as R programmers just want a data frame, right? So the good news is like when you're making these requests, it gets translated to lists in R. That might not be good news to some of you. I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't like lists, but in this case, it's a little easier to work with. So yeah, you don't have to know JSON in particular. But what I will say is that when you're interacting with like JSON files, using $ and then tab completion is your friend because it lets you kind of traverse everything in there. So this is a little table that basically shows how our HTTP-R2 translates JSON into lists. Oh, okay. So there's going to be a section we're going to skip then. Okay, so this is that example. So this is kind of the last part I'm going to be talking about. So what we're going to hit another endpoint and try to get information out of it. So there is, remember our last one was called /fact. This one is called /facts. So this is what our request looks like. It's more, a little more detailed. And this is what the response looks like. So this is a much more complicated JSON document, but you'll see that there's actually ways to get stuff out of there. So here we're taking that response and we're extracting the JSON from it. And so like when we have no clue about the JSON structure, this is what I always do is I look at the names of in the list. And we can see that there is a slot here called data. So that's our first clue that might be what we need. Okay, so when we actually poke into that data slot, we can see it's a list and it's a numbered list. So each of those contains a cat fact. So we can use per if we want just the facts to do a little bit of extraction. Here we're just, if you've worked with per before, you know it works with lists. There's a lot of utilities that let you kind of process lists. I actually didn't mention per, but it's a very useful package. Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to end on. I think the last bit is not as important as this. So this is a data set that's provided as JSON. So this is from the City Bikes API. This got cut off, but this is actually, so you can see it ends in .json here. And you can see that this is a mess. Like, you know, if you had to get the information out, it would be very difficult. So again, using the magic of the $sign and the tab completion key, we can kind of dive into this list. And we can see that there's a data slot. And then in the data slot, there is the stations. So we can get that out. And sorry, I missed this part. So this is where that jsonlite package comes from, or comes into play. So this from JSON function will basically parse this and get the information out for us. And so here we've got this is just part of the table. So you can see that there's a ton of information that we can get here. These are all the city bike stations in New York. And now that we have that as a data frame, we can do lots of cool things with this. Like, you know, I'm not a big leaflet expert, but I managed to do this. So once it's in a data frame, the world is your oyster. Okay, so I'm going to skip this last section. Again, the slides will be online. And I have a much more if you go into the RStudio project, there's a lot more information about it. So the one thing I didn't talk about is this idea of API keys and secret management. So there's a great article here. So basically, a lot of times you're going to subscribe to an API. So this is how you kind of provide that information. So this is where I kind of started. So there's a tutorial about web APIs. There's this nice list of APIs to play with. So, you know, if you want to kind of try this yourself. And then there is this, when you start getting more advanced, there is this great R OpenSci thing called HTTP testing in R. So hopefully you learned this stuff, or at least learned how to recognize some of these things. And thank you very much. So this is where the slides are, and please reach out if you have any questions. So that's it. Thank you.